Well, thank you very much, and I'm very excited to have been invited to this symposium. So up till this point, we've heard a lot about how human brains are different from other animals, and lots of detail about exactly how they're different and how they operate. But now I'm going to switch gears to talking about why our brains are different. So what were the selective factors involved in the evolution of our large brains? And this is necessarily a lot more speculative, and we're talking about hypotheses here. So this is something that people have thought a lot about, and especially in primates over the last 50, 60 years, people have thought about this question. And ideas have kind of coalesced around two major hypotheses, which are not mutually exclusive. So the sometimes called ecological hypothesis, ecological intelligence hypothesis, and the social brain hypothesis. So in the 1980s, when people started gathering data about primates in the wild, researchers looked at ecological correlates of brain size. And they found, for example, that frugivores, fruit eaters, had larger ranges and bigger brains than folivores, those that ate leaves. And they argued that this was because fruit has a much more complicated distribution, both spatially and temporally. And so they needed more brain power to remember where fruit was than where leaves were in their environment, and a larger range. Others pointed out that there were brain differences in size of brain. Primates had larger brains if they extracted food from their environment. For example, think about burrowing insects or cracking open nuts to get the kernel, and that this required more complicated technology and higher brain power. But the idea of the social brain has been prominent for a long time, and it was really Alison Jolly who first pointed out that in different lemur species, they had different kinds of societies, and she, and then later on Nick Humphreys, 10 years later, talked about the importance of the social environment in leading to brain evolution and brain expansion. That that your social companions, if you can predict their behavior better, you can manipulate, you can compete with them better for your own ends, and that the social environment actually can select for increased brain complexity. And this was developed in this influential book by Dick Byrne and Andy Whiten, Machiavellian Intelligence. And it's been particularly, this whole idea has been particularly discussed by Robin Dunbar and his colleagues. And these kinds of studies, which are broad comparative studies looking for correlations between brain size and social aspects of the social environment, have become increasingly complex. They involve phylogenetic techniques where you take into account phylogeny to account for similarities between related species. And they have been done particularly in primates, but also in other groups of animals now. And there has been considerable support for this idea that the social environment is important. One of the factors they look at particularly is group size. As group size goes up, brain size often goes up, but also other aspects of social complexity of relationships. But using these same kinds of techniques and yet more data, there's been considerable support again for the ecological intelligence hypothesis, with a number of papers coming out just in the last year, swinging back to this idea that diet is important and maybe more important than the social brain idea. So what I'm going to do today is compare chimpanzees and humans to look at particularly ecological factors that may have led to the evolution of our brain. You've seen this phylogenetic tree many times now. Chimpanzees and bonobos are our closest living relatives and shared a common ancestor around about 6 or so million years ago. And many scientists believe that chimpanzees were probably quite like, that the last common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans was probably quite like a chimpanzee. So by comparing chimps and humans, we can look for similarities and differences, as we've been talking about, and then try to think about the factors that changed over the evolution of our lineage. And we've seen these pictures before too. The chimp brain is more like a human brain than any other species, a non-human species, but still a lot smaller. And that it's been particularly the neocortex that has become increasingly complex in the human brain, which we assume it supports sophisticated intelligence. So the argument the ideas I want to review today are particularly looking at the ecological changes in the ecology between chimpanzees, or at least a last common ancestor, along the hominin line to humans. I've spent most of my career studying wild chimpanzees, and I've also taught introductory animal behavior classes through my career, and it's always come as a surprise to my students in animal behavior classes when we start talking about the development of skillful behavior, like birds making nests, spiders spinning webs, that they are not generally taught by their parents. And usually some of the students in the first exams, when I ask the question, how did they manage to do these behaviors, say their parents taught them. And this comes from really our own experience, that this is how we learn a lot of things from other more knowledgeable individuals in our social groups. So it always became a considerable surprise to them that teaching is actually very rare in non-human animals. And I became interested in teaching in chimpanzees, if it occurs, and if not, what happened during the evolution of humans that became, where teaching became more selectively advantageous. And in this talk, of course, a lot of people have talked and thought about these questions. I'm particularly influenced in this talk by 2 papers, one by developmental psychologists Sibra and Gergely, and one by anthropologists Hilly Kaplan and his colleagues. Sibra and Gergely argue that teaching is a human universal which is not present in the other non-human apes. And they define natural pedagogy as an evolutionary adaptation, which is a kind of social learning where knowledge and skills is passed on by communication to others. So the kinds of things that they talk about in active teaching, the teacher uses signals or that they use things like eye contact, pointing, demonstrating particular salient parts of a task. And the learner is predisposed, and in the case that even pre-verbal infants are predisposed to pay attention to adults performing new behaviors. So to give you an informal example, this is my 2-year-old granddaughter who really, I think on her 2nd birthday, for the first time encountered these very interesting objects which had bright colors and different shapes. And eventually she found out that that not only was their outside interesting, but if you tore the paper off, there was something even more interesting inside. And her mother was fully aware of the task she was doing.
stuck.
Fishy ears.
Fishy. Whoa. See? Should we open it?
So there's a lot of communication going on here. The mother knows what the child needs, and she's sort of helping, but allowing her to do it. And then there's some, she's talking, but I don't think that's necessary. This could be done by pantomime gestures too. And then the child communicates. She said stuck, and then the mother helped. So this is just the kind of thing where it's clear that the knowledgeable adult is doing something special to help the transmission of the learning of the task. And as part of this kind of teaching, theory of mind is important. By theory of mind, we mean understanding that individuals have minds that can entertain different beliefs and knowledge from your own. And of course, for the teacher in this case understands that the learner is ignorant and is able to understand that they have different beliefs and abilities. The idea of theory of mind, the question is whether other animals have any sort of theory of mind as well. This was something that was studied for many years with negative results in chimpanzees. But more recently, my colleague Brian Hare and others have shown that indeed chimps can understand that others can have different knowledge in terms of what they can see and not see compared to themselves. But this kind of ability is mostly revealed in competitive contexts. But clearly this is a quality that has been much developed in humans. So the kind of ideas I want to put forward today, summarized here, what changed between a chimpanzee-like human ancestor and modern humans. And I'm going being very much influenced by the Kaplan et al. Paper here. So there was clearly a shift in diet from a chimpanzee-like creature to humans, where the diet shifted to a diet that was higher in quality, that the individual items that compose the diet are higher quality. They're also harder to acquire. But being higher quality, that allows more energy for brain, for support of a more complex brain. The food items tend also to be in larger packets, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And for the first time, that allows individuals finding food to have enough left over to provision others, and that's an important part of this argument. Because the food items are harder to acquire, they often require tool use or other, especially when we think about modern humans, there's cooking. There are many skills which are quite complicated. So skill acquisition becomes more difficult. And given that the food is now in larger packets and individuals procuring food are able to provision others, give food to others, there would be a selective advantage to the providers of the food to help the dependents who are consuming the food they're producing produce their own food more quickly. For those ignorant younger individuals, there's an advantage to learning the skills of procuring food. And so the argument would go then that this is real selection for active teaching of the kind I just described, which requires presumably more complex neural underpinnings and more complex cognitive structures in the brain. So let's walk through some of the steps here in more detail. So first of all, talking about the shift in diet. Chimpanzees are ripe fruit specialists. They spend probably 40 to 60% of their diet is ripe fruit, but they also eat other parts of plants, all of which are easily collected and eaten. But they do spend some time extracting food. So they, for example, in the study site where I study them in Gombe National Park, they can spend hours getting termites out of mounds at certain times of year. And they also do hunt. And they hunt in groups, especially when they're hunting monkeys like red colobus monkeys. And they even, to some extent, share that meat. So they do gain some large packets of food as well. But if we characterize the chimpanzee diet, which is, again, from this Kaplan paper, they mostly eat plant parts, but there's some extracted foods and some hunted animals as well in their diet. If we contrast this to the diet of foraging humans, so these are hunter-gatherer societies studied by Kaplan and his colleagues who were still dependent completely on wild plants and wild animals for their diet. There's a much stronger reliance on hunting and large game and extracted foods, things like honey, tubers, think about underground tubers which have to be dug up from the ground, and less reliance on the plant parts and leaves and so on. And if we look at the nutrient density of each food item, it increases as we go down this list. And the skill level increases as we go. The skill level for procuring that food increases as we go down this list. So this graph, again, from the Kaplan paper, plots it in a different way. This shows the percentage of the diet that's made up of collected food, so those would be plant parts, extracted foods like termites or underground tubers, and hunted food for chimpanzees and humans. And so really most of the chimpanzee diet is collected foods, but there is some extracted and hunted. But for the humans, it's opposite, and we have far more reliance on these other kinds of more difficult to acquire foods. And this is just put down here so that these are somewhat low difficulty, low calorific value, small package size, and then we go to high on all those characters. And then we can also get sharing of these large packets. So just coming back to this idea, once there are large packets of food, they can be shared with others. And I'd like to now talk about that because that's a new feature in human evolution. Here, these graphs, I'll show you the calories produced per day by an individual over its lifespan, so from birth to death. The calories that are produced by an individual and consumed by an individual, or put it actually the other way around, consumed. So let's start, and I'm going to compare chimpanzees and humans. So starting with female chimpanzees, these are estimates of the calories they consume per day at different ages. And then we look at the calories that they produce per different day for different ages. And at the very beginning, they're dependent on their mother's milk, but very quickly they start collecting their own food. And for most of their lives, they are collecting everything that they eat, or procuring everything that they eat. Same is true for male chimpanzees. But now we look at foraging the humans in these hunter-gatherer societies. They consume absolutely more calories per day. They are larger in body size, but their brains are also more expensive. They have a high metabolism. But then if we look at production, it's totally different. So young female humans are not really producing any food until they're about 5, and the amount they produce doesn't actually cross the amount they consume, at least in these societies that Kaplan and al. Were looking at, until they're pretty old. If we look at males, the pattern is a bit different. But again, and males in these societies actually procuring more food, but not until they're in their 20s. So what's going on here, presumably, is that it takes a while to acquire the skills necessary to procure the food. And it seems likely that a lot of it has to do with learning those skills, as well as probably some degree of change in strength as body sizes increase. So, given this situation, we could argue that the provisioners would actually benefit by helping their dependents, of the younger dependents, procure food themselves more quickly. So, coming back to this idea that there's a selective advantage to helping others learn. And this is a rather clunky way of showing this idea that if they're teaching, then the young ones can learn more quickly and acquire the skills. So this is an argument for why we see the evolution of active teaching. So the kinds of skills that we're looking at in modern human foragers are quite complicated. They involve many steps. Sometimes the end point isn't necessarily clear. If you think about making a poison arrow or cooking food that is inedible otherwise. So let's now turn and take a closer look at chimpanzee skillful food acquisition. And I really want to show you tool use. Chimpanzees do use tools. In fact, they use and make tools more than any other non-human species. And I'll show you a few examples and then talk about how they acquire these skills. So this is leaf sponging. The chimp chews up a bunch of leaves and then uses it to soak up water and suck the water out. She was doing it in a stream, but they will often do this for water in tree trunks or in puddles. So it's a way of getting water when water's scarce. This is termite fishing, which they do in many different areas, but particularly where I studied them at Gombe, they can spend hours a day during certain times of year. So they're catching underground termites. And it's quite difficult. You have to thread the holes that that they're pushing the grass down. Sometimes bend, and you can see them sort of screwing it in. And it's the soldier termites which are protecting those burrows that then attack the tool and they're pulled out. So this is a way of getting far more nutritious termites than you can just by trying to. The soldiers actually are not on the surface of the mound. This is fishing for army ants. They're very nasty, biting ants, but they're also nutritious, and they occur in huge swarms sometimes. If you step in those, you know it, that you're bitten all over, but they keep off the ground. You get them in fairly quick and don't get too many bites. And then in West Africa, but not in East Africa, they actually use stone tools. They crack nuts open to get the nutritious kernel, hard nuts. And this requires at least two tools. There's the anvil, there's the hammer, and sometimes they'll use a third tool, another stone, to keep the anvil flat if they put it underneath the anvil. Now, that may have looked as though, well, okay, let me go on. So we are very interested in how they acquire these tool use skills. And they do vary from population to population, the kinds of tools they use and the kinds of things they use them for. So back in, I guess, 17 years or so ago now, my student Elizabeth Lonsdorf spent 4 years going each season to record the behavior of chimps while they were termiting, families of chimps while they were termiting. So she was able to watch infants from birth to when they were 5 or 6 years old. And she recorded, she videoed them systematically, and then she spent many, many hours analyzing the video, categorizing different kinds of behavior involved in termite fishing. And every time she came back, I'd say, well, are you seeing any sort of active teaching? And she said, no. What she sees, though, is that the infants are very interested in observing their mothers very closely, and they reach for termites, they play with the tools, but the mother just keeps going. She just keeps going, feeding herself. She's tolerant, but she doesn't do anything in the way of, putting the tool in, letting the infant take it out, or anything that we would construe as the kind of teaching I'm showing you. The infant's very interested in the whole process. And they do a lot of playing around themselves. They play with the tools. They pick up termites off anything that is on the surface. And they eventually start poking the tool into a hole. It takes a year or two before they get anything out. So it's a long process, a lot of trial and error on their own. And I said the mothers are tolerant, but sometimes they're less tolerant. This is a little male. That's his mother on top of the termite mound. She's fishing. Now he's got her tool. She takes it back. He's just in the way. So what Elizabeth found, and I should say that there have been similar detailed studies in nut cracking by Tetsuro Matsuzawa and others in Japan, Japanese researchers working in West Africa, and also of ant fishing to some extent as well. So they observe very closely these young chimps. And there's some low fidelity copying. I mean, so what Elizabeth found was that the young females, they watched more closely, they gained the skill more quickly. Mothers varied a lot in the length of the tool, the termite fishing tool that they used, and it turned out that the daughters used the same length of tool, roughly, as their mothers. So there's some copying going on, but not really what you could call imitation. A lot of individual practice, but we would argue no active teaching. If we compare this with humans, of course, there's observation. There's very precise imitation by young children. My colleague Mike Tomasello calls children imitation machines, and they overcopy. I mean, they will copy things even when it's clear that not all the actions are actually necessary to achieve the task. There's, of course, individual practice there, but there's active teaching in humans. So, to summarize then, I've emphasized the importance of ecological factors in the development of human skills, particularly as the diet changed, procuring the food became more difficult, tool use became more sophisticated, and it's harder to understand what the end point is. Teaching really becomes important. Thank you. And I should quickly thank my...
Thank you very much. We have time for one or two questions.
So very quickly, you mentioned as an aside that your granddaughter, it would have worked as well with pantomime as with language. But I'm sure you know this recent study by Kevin Leyland suggesting the opposite, that in fact, if you try and do teaching without actually using language, it's vastly less effective. If you can point, you can pantomime, you can grunt, but if you can't talk, it doesn't work very well. So, I mean, do you stand by that idea that language doesn't matter?
I'm not strongly wedded to that, but it does seem to me likely that gestures could come first, and that language would make it all much better and easier and more effective. Yeah. But I think there could be a strong component of teaching before you get to language.
The question? What?
Hey, I wanted to ask, is there active teaching in all human cultures?
Well, that's a good question. And I mean, I'm not an anthropologist. That's a question that Sieber and Gergely took on in their paper. And I'm sure we'll hear more maybe later on from our next speakers. But certainly there's seems to be, well, it's far more formal teaching in our kind of society than there is in, say, hunter-gatherer societies. But according to them, all the societies that have been looked at have a word for teaching, to start with, and they found examples of some kind of teaching of the kind I was describing in all the cultures. That was their view. I'm not an expert on that. Yeah.
The idea of over-limitation in humans is, I find it really interesting that it's different from chimpanzees, which I didn't know.
Right.
So is there any research into either the advantages or disadvantages of this kind of limitation or the neuronal basis?
Okay, I don't know if everyone heard the question, but the question is about over-imitation and if there's an advantage in the neural. Okay. And is it different in... Right. So this has been, the imitation has been studied by, in chimps by various people where they've given them puzzle boxes where you, the demonstrator makes a number of actions before they get the food out. And the boxes vary in whether there's a transparent part, so you can see what the thing that they're poking in is doing and whether it's actually doing something useful or not. And these interesting experiments with chimps show that the chimps will copy all the actions if they can't see, if it's opaque. But if they can see, then they stop doing the bit that's not necessary, whereas kids go on doing it. So that's sort of an example of over-imitation. And that, I guess the argument is that, you know, a lot of things that humans do, the end point isn't necessarily clear, so it's probably an advantage to do everything that everyone... But there's obviously, there's a danger there too, if you start doing all kinds of things which aren't...
Last question.
How consciousness affect, or different level of consciousness, how is affected by this process of learning or affect?
Sorry, could you say that once more?
Consciousness.
Consciousness.
How consciousness is affected or affect the process of learning?
I'm going to punt that question. I think I don't know about. I mean, it's very hard to say to know what level of consciousness chimps are experiencing. So I'm just going to leave that there.
Thank you very much.